Hi, everybody. Welcome to Cyberside Chats. My name is Sherry Davidoff,
I'm Matt Duran.
and today we're going to talk about security debt. I am really excited about this topic. I think it's a great term
It is a frightening term.
to refer to that accumulated debt that we have. Things like, I don't have time to patch this right now, and maybe we're going to wait too long. Or we don't have time to go through and activate all of the configuration changes that
Yeah.
we want to on a certain
I
system.
haven't had time to go through Active Directory and clear out the 100,000 users I have over
Yes.
15 years of business or something like that.
Can
Yeah,
potentially help us with some of these
maybe.
things, I think. Maybe. Anyway, security debt. We have gone through cases with a fine tooth comb and come up with 5 different types of security debt that we should be thinking about. So why don't we go through them, and then we're going to go through the case studies, and we'll take questions from everybody at the end. Love our live
Love it.
versions of these. Okay. So first of all, we have identity debt.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're all too familiar with this. Things like stale admin credentials that don't get changed in time, lack of MFA, old accounts, maybe simple and important things like requiring a second person to approve really important things like wiping 200,000 devices.
Right. We'll get into that here in a second. It's like the two keys to open the safe kind of thing that we see in a lot
Yeah.
of banks.
So identity debt.
Yeah.
And then we have life cycle debt.
Life
You wanna
cycle.
take that
Yeah.
one on?
Life cycle debt is, that's just unsupported operating systems. And that we see this pop up in so many different industries, especially when we talk about like medical and legal.
Yeah.
You buy some like very important piece of software and it has to run on like a very specific version of like old Windows or something like that.
Right. And
And
maybe
so,
like
yeah,
hospitals you see where vendors maybe didn't sign a contract requiring them to
right.
allow their so their software can run on new versions.
Maybe it just can't. Like we still see like to this day Windows XP running in some of those environments, which is
Yeah, it's crazy.
terrifying, but it has to run that way.
Well, CISA recently put out a binding directive on this, by the way. It's called Mitigating Risk from End of Support Edge Devices
Yeah.
because they are so high risk. They're often facing the internet. They may have lots of vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So, how do we deal with that? And that gets to our next one.
Architectural.
Architecture debt. That's
Yeah,
right. Is your network segmented? We've been meaning to do that for a while.
exactly.
Flat networks, excessive trust relationships between environments as well. That kind of thing. Architecture debt.
Yeah. And then governance,
Governance.
which we have to talk about.
We
I mean,
did a
these,
merger,
yeah,
and nobody ever figured out who owns that system.
yeah,
That's
exactly,
why it was behind on patches.
exactly. Like, yeah, no clear owner, no updates to policy, no, yeah,
Exceptions that don't expire, that's
yep.
governance debt. We just never got around to reviewing those exceptions, so they stayed forever.
And then our last one, which working in IT, I was completely familiar with, is operational.
Operational
Yeah,
debt.
not having the time to fix the things you need to fix.
And often when we think about security debt, that is the thing we think about.
Yeah,
Veracode actually did a study where they specifically focused on that operational debt, and they identified, I think it was actually 82%, 82% of organizations, according to Veracode, carry that operational security debt.
well, I mean, think about when you look at like the revolt or the results of like a vulnerability scan, and there are 1,000 items on that list. You can prioritize and get like the high severity options taken care of, but I mean, in a lot of cases, IT departments are a little bit bootstrapped and don't have the manpower or the time to actually fix every single one of those items on the list. So,
Well, and now that things like Mythos Preview, Anthropic's new model are
mhm,
here, operational debt is going to really increase because
yeah,
the time between patching versus discovering a vulnerability, it needs to get way smaller because it's so fast for adversaries to be able to exploit.
yeah, no,
So
sometimes, yeah.
operational debt is going to become increasingly important.
I mean, when we looked at exploitation time previously, like prior to something like Mythos being out there, I mean, we were looking at, I mean, what was it, like less than an hour between when like
Often.
the source code or the GitHub code for an exploit would come out to when we would see it actively exploited. I mean, it was
Sometimes it's
ridiculously fast.
weeks
Yeah,
before there's any
yeah,
kind of announcement also, proxy shell.
uh-huh.
So we have to worry about that stuff as well.
Yes.
But anyway,
Okay.
let's get into stories.
Okay. Let's do it.
Stryker specifically.
Oh, Stryker, that is such a
Yeah.
good story. Okay, so with Stryker, what we saw from them was basically a lack of identity and access management control inside of their admin environment in Microsoft.
Right.
So, an attacker was able to, potentially, months ahead of time, gain access into their, Microsoft 365 system or
They're
their
in
yeah,
tune
their
and they're
Intune system. Yeah,
probably harvesting an admin credential
right.
from like a compromised device or something like that. That is the speculation right
Exactly,
now.
that's the speculation right now,
So
and
one little admin credential resulted in what,
yeah,
200,000 devices?
200,000 devices being wiped out. So, what they were able to do, and again, this is based on analysis from other companies. Like there's some speculation involved here, but it looks like what the attackers were able to do was create their own admin account. So now they have persistent access into the system. They were then able to push a group policy object, which was a PowerShell script, which wiped out the user directory of everyone's computer and then replaced it all with just random filler files.
Right. And what we know
Yeah.
for sure was that the devices were rendered
Yeah,
useless.
exactly.
That
Like
is
this is basically, I mean, this is, ransomware without the ability to decrypt is kind of what it came down to. It was
wiperware.
yeah, it was wiping the files completely out the computer systems, rendering those devices back to basically like, brand new from the manufacturer state and just annihilating the file systems, which was a unique take on that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that happened, I believe it was March 11th that Stryker announced this. They put out an SEC 8K just saying, like, hey, we had a cybersecurity incident. It's caused global disruption. And so, what kinds of debts contributed to this?
Well, let's start with identity.
Yes.
There was, yeah, a single account potentially being compromised led to I mean, this was like the waterfall that led to this entire attack. And what it came down to was a couple of things. I mean, weak or non-existent multi-factor authentication on an account, the need for double admin verification before you are able to make a big change, especially something like pushing a group policy object to every computer that's associated with your domain. Like those are big things.
Right.
And while 10 years ago that might not have been a problem, now it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And really, we need a second person to be able to approve those things.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, it's the 2 keys to open the safe kind of thing that most banks use. Like,
A lot of times people are underutilizing multi-factor authentication internally or within applications
yeah.
as well. Not necessarily the case here, but I just want to highlight
Oh,
that because
sure, sure,
it's
yeah.
a frequent problem.
No, that makes sense.
So that identity debt is important, and often that stems from governance debt. Who can execute commands? Who is authorized to execute or to do these important functions?
Right.
You have to identify that role or those people in advance in order to implement some of these changes. And sometimes that's where people
Yeah.
get stuck.
Well, and like we said, the speculation here is that they were in the Stryker like infrastructure for a while before any of this actually executed. So something like a notification about a new admin account being
Right.
created that goes out to every other admin on the network or something like that would have at least given like a red flag that something was happening that wasn't supposed
Yep,
to be.
absolutely. So, Change Healthcare, of course, was a really big story in 2024 and another good illustration of the impacts of security debt. I mean, remember, with security debt, these risks are accumulating, and often it's an incident, a big incident in some cases, that really reveals that they've occurred.
Sure, sure.
All the way, I mean, all the major cases I can think of, like Target and TJ Maxx and things like that, you could point to those ahead of time. Equifax is another one, a missing patch, operational. Um,
The one guy who forgot to patch a server
yeah,
at
but it's
Equifax.
not a one
Yeah,
person thing. It's a process that's missing.
right.
So let's move on to change. So on
Yeah.
February 12th, 2024, the Black Hat operators logged into the Changed Healthcare's Citrix portal, which had no multi factor authentication.
Yes, that
So I know you dealt with the Black Hat
I
ransomware quite a
I
bit.
have personally dealt with them, yeah, and they are brutal. I mean, they will go for like as much destruction as they can possibly get inside an environment. And with Change, that was one of the cases. I mean, they annihilated their server infrastructure,
And
which
they
yeah,
exfil too,
yeah.
right?
Oh yeah, no, they stole like what was like 6 terabytes of data.
Yes. Yeah. And they moved laterally through the environment undetected for 9 days.
Yeah,
So, right there, we can see multiple issues, multiple different kinds of security debt. Number one, just being able to move laterally like that for 9 days,
yeah.
architecture debt.
That's the architecture debt right there. Like knowing that there was limited or insufficient segmentation of the network
Yeah.
or something like that is a giant problem.
And
And
visibility as
yeah,
well.
and I mean, we talk about that with a lot of clients, but I mean, segmenting a network, especially something that's been around for a while, like going through and redoing the architecture,
Right.
is a tough thing to do. Like that takes a ton of time, it takes a ton of effort, and you have to make sure it's done correctly. Otherwise, you end up with like any
Breaking
yeah.
features. You can break people's everyday
Yeah,
life.
exactly. Well, and this is why when we look at things like firewalls, oftentimes we'll see like those any rules that
Right.
just allow traffic to go in and out of the network, unfettered because somebody had a problem and they needed to fix it right away. So they just made like, a band-aid change and then it
Right.
just never got reversed.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
as a result, they had $872 million in damage. And yes, there were those ripple effects.
that is such a staggering of like
Unable
number.
to
Yeah.
fulfill orders, and it was
Yeah.
impossible for some organizations to schedule things. The organizations that relied on change were really impacted by this
Yeah.
outage.
So the 9-day thing I think is really important when we talk about like how long these actors were able to remain inside the network without being detected.
Yeah,
So I mean, we oftentimes talk about in one of our classes we talk about the 1-10-60 rule. So you want to be able to identify that there's a threat within 1 minute, identify the risk of the threat within 10, and then like annihilate within 60 minutes.
it's a lot of red.
It's a lot of pressure, but if you're set up correctly, you can do it.
Well, and with again with Mythos Preview, it's changing these timeframes,
Yep.
and I think more and more we have to assume perimeter systems are going to get compromised. I mean, there are they've already found thousands upon thousands of
Right.
vulnerabilities in common software that cannot possibly be fixed. In some cases, for months or even years. There's just too many of them.
Sometimes they're just architectural problems that literally cannot ever be fixed.
Right.
Like, yeah,
So that's why segmentation just became even more important.
right.
If you assume that your perimeter systems may well be compromised, it's really important to make sure that those attackers can't move laterally. So that architecture debt is one that I wanted to call attention to.
Yeah,
And the other thing I think that's really interesting about the change breach was that it was traced back to the 2022 merger between Optum and Change.
right.
So this was an acquisition integration of different technical systems.
Yeah, so this is your life cycle that you're
Right.
talking about, right?
So often in those cases, there's a system in the corner that nobody's handed off, that
Mhm.
maybe is unmanaged. You've applied patches to everything else, but not that one because nobody really took ownership of
Right.
it. So that's the life cycle debt, maybe even governance debt that relates to it.
Yeah, yeah, just general accountability when it comes down to, like, who is responsible for those systems, how are they being maintained, what is the actual patching cycle on them? Like, and a lot of that, especially in a really big network, and when you're, integrating other networks into it can just be overlooked.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then there was the big one, identity debt, of course, which was
yeah,
the lack of MFA on the system. So that's again pretty clear
yeah,
cut.
yeah.
So that's the Change Healthcare case. Can we move on to one of our favorite
Is
case
it
studies?
is it Colonial?
It is Colonial
I
Pipeline.
love it.
Colonial Pipeline
Yep.
kind of checks all the check boxes
Yeah, they
when it
do.
comes to.
Yeah, VPN problem.
So, do you want to talk about dark side?
Oh god, dark side.
2021,
Yep.
May
So
2021, the East Coast, suddenly 45% of the fuel on the East Coast was cut off.
yeah, yeah, and it's because DarkSide was able to gain access into the VPN account that was supposedly no longer in use, but
Yes.
it gave them access to the system, and because of that, they were able to not take down the distribution system for Colonial, but their billing system.
Right. And part of why
Yeah,
we know so much about what happened is because they have been in court. And
yeah,
part of why well, there's a few reasons they've been in court. But one of those is because they voluntarily shut down the fuel pipeline.
right, yeah,
Because if they couldn't figure out how to track and bill, they were like, we don't want to, continue to supply things. So
right.
that was a voluntary choice,
It was.
which of course had ripple effects up and down the East Coast.
The other problem with that was and I remember this from our ransomware class. Like someone leaked a copy of the ransomware note that was popped up in the Colonial Pipeline
Right.
system, and the link to the Onion website they were using for negotiations was published like to the world.
Didn't you like jump into the negotiation channel?
I
Everybody else?
I watched it. I did not jump into
Okay,
it, but
well, that's
other
what I meant.
but other people did. So
Talking,
yeah.
negotiating.
Yeah, there were people that just decided to start adding their own 2 cents to the negotiations that were going on, and so that's how we knew, 1, who the ransomware group was, and 2, what I guess the severity of the attack was, because DarkSide's a pretty verbose ransomware group. I mean,
They
they will tell you exactly what they did to your
came
network,
out
and
later
like
and they were like, "We're really
yeah.
sorry. We didn't mean to shut down the pipeline."
Yeah, once it became more of a, national security issue, they
Yes.
apologized and then rebranded, and, they had this entire, like, new website where they talked about how they wouldn't attack certain sectors, and, like, yeah, that was
So
hilarious. That's
so ended up paying about $4.4 million
yeah,
roughly in Bitcoin, and law enforcement was able to get almost half of that back. I think
yeah,
more than half of it.
yeah, yeah, they were able to hit a
really unusual angle to
Yeah, they were
use.
able to hit a crypto exchange and actually get some of that money back. I mean, at that point in time, it was, too late to really do anything about it. The other thing that I really love about this case, though, is the efficiency of the software that the attackers were using. So they had a really, really nice, efficient style of ransomware. It would encrypt, everything on the network, and
It's writing
I
script
mean,
rules.
you have to give
Right,
credit
go
where
on,
credit's
go
due.
on.
But when they bought the decryptor was so slow
That's
that
right.
they just
News
yeah,
articles about how slow it
yeah,
was.
they just stopped using it because it was faster to recover from their old backup system than it was to use the decryptor that they actually paid, $4.5 million for,
So
which
ransomware gangs can be like vibe coding decryptor tools now.
I think they already
Sure, they
they
already are.
already are.
Why did I even ask
Yeah.
that out loud? Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
Anyway,
This hits on really kind of all of the different kinds of debt. I made a list here. So you have
yeah,
identity debt. There's a password on an inactive account with no MFA. Boom,
right.
identity debt
Yeah.
right there. It's
Attackers in the door.
supposed to be an inactive account. You have lifecycle debt. The VPN was described as legacy technology that didn't even support multi-factor authentication.
Right.
So that's not even supporting modern auth.
Yeah.
So clearly lifecycle debt.
Architecture.
Architecture debt, the encryption of the billing environment led to a shutdown of the OT pipeline operations. Again, that was voluntary, so you can
Sure.
perhaps debate.
But I mean, to be fair, you can understand why they did that.
Well, they were worried
Yeah.
that it might have also affected the other environments as well.
Sure.
There's the governance debt. Oh, one thing we didn't mention is that they had no CISO at the time of the attack.
Yeah, that's
It's
rough.
expensive. Oftentimes, organizations don't want to invest in a full-time CISO.
Mhm.
You can be a fractional CISO, or you can have a fractional CISO.
Yeah, or a virtual CISO or something like that. Like that's
Yep.
that's why that's become such a popular thing lately.
Yep.
So yeah.
And then there's the operational debt, the need for account deprovisioning, credential hygiene, perimeter hardening that were available controls that were not in effect at the time.
Right.
And again, that's something that we saw with the Intune case with Stryker,
Yeah.
where the controls to have that in the case of Stryker, that second person to approve, the controls were available. Like the technology was
Oh,
there.
it's there. Yeah.
No one had taken the time to go through and configure and set that.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's debt.
That
Debt
makes sense.
too. All right. Do you want to talk about the Pulse?
Oh, Pulse
Your
VPN. Yeah. So the Avanti Connect Secure case that happened back,
2024,
yeah,
20.
2024, 2025. So this came back to again a problem with a VPN system, and I don't want to beat up on Pulse, although they do pop up frequently in headlines as like there's a Pulse vulnerability that you need to
Maybe
watch out for. But
facing
yeah.
systems are going to be high risk.
No, exactly. But in this case, there was a group that was able to reverse engineer a patch for them, and was then able to break in through just the Pulse VPN connection, and it led to, I mean, quite a bit of I guess pain from the security
Yes.
industry.
And this is just
Yeah,
straightforward, lack of
yeah,
patching. So that's life cycle debt, actually, where not just lack of patching, but it's an end of support. So it can't
yeah,
possibly receive patches. So that's why it's not just operational debt, it is life cycle debt.
yeah. When you
We're not tracking or actually retiring things.
Yeah,
So you
you
can't.
you hit end of life on something and you continue to use it in your network because I mean, in a lot of cases, and again, this is from the IT perspective, but in a lot of cases, those things have just been in the network for a while. They're potentially like pillars of operation that you need to work with, and if you take them out or if you try to update them, it could break every other thing that you have working there. Like there's these connections that you have to think about. So
Right.
yeah,
I like how you have the boots on the ground perspective, because from the management perspective,
hmm
I'm a manager. Um, they're two different problems, and that's why
yeah,
we're breaking down these different types of debt because they have different solutions. If you have patches that haven't been applied, that's something that maybe you need more staff, maybe you need better tools, better visibility. Whereas if you have something that's past its end of life, hey, maybe you need to invest in different assets or
right.
tracking that system is end of life. Is not that a patch hasn't been applied; it's that you need a new device.
Yeah, you need a new system at
Or
that
new.
point, and those aren't instantaneous changes, and oftentimes they're really expensive too, which is why, again, we see a delay in a lot of those deployments. Like
Mhm.
it's a tough thing to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, should we talk about key takeaways?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, and since this is Cyberside Chats Live, we will also take some questions at the end if you have them. So feel free to write those into the chat. But in the meantime, what are our big takeaways from these stories, these cases that we've seen?
So I think the first one that comes down to Stryker is you need to have that dual approval for like high level admin actions on a system. If there's
I
something,
like
yeah,
that.
if
Yep.
there's something that's going to be destructive or could potentially wipe out, I don't know, 200,000 devices, there should be some kind of secondary verification in place to make sure that just not any random person can go do that on their own.
Yeah, and that hits two different types of debt, the identity debt
Yeah.
and the governance debt.
Yeah.
So back up and say, hey, you kind of want to audit what are these really important actions that could be taken that you would want a second person to approve in your environment? And
Mhm.
then who is authorized to do that? And once you've handled those two pieces of governance debt, then you can go and create a process to manage that. You can take advantage of any features in Intune or similar systems that can facilitate that. But it's all about that first piece, backing it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, number two, this is a gimme. Enforce phishing resistant
Let's
multi factor authentication
let's beat this dead
free
horse.
on at least your admin and every remote access path over and
Yes.
over and over. We see that this is missed. Again, that identity debt. And I like how we're starting to put in there phishing resistant
Yeah.
because it has just become the new standard. Having, a number that you type in just isn't really going to cut it
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah, no, the old SMS based or, email based multi-factor authentication, I mean, just doesn't cut it.
Yep.
So, yeah,
Want to do the
there you go.
next one?
Yeah, yeah. So, when we look at accounts in a network, and this is something that I've dealt with personally, I mean, we want to separate admin accounts from daily work accounts. And this just comes down to a basic security control that means that when you need to elevate to admin to do something, you have a very specific account. Oftentimes with Microsoft, they have like the just-in-time admin
Yes.
accounts that are only available for like, an hour or something like that. And for the rest of your work, you have a separate account that does not have that level of privilege. This comes down to the principle of least privilege and the zero trust architecture that we've talked about for years at this point. But it becomes super, super important, and it's not really that difficult to work with. Like I've done it before. It's like a
I think
second password or something you need, but yeah,
Yeah, some of the worst cases we've seen are when an admin gets
yeah,
compromised. Stryker being a great example of that. So, in some cases, you also see those admin passwords end up on the dark web where they can be
right.
purchased or just acquired for free in some cases. So, the less your admins are using those accounts, then the more you're reducing their risk of having things like passwords stolen or getting tricked by some targeted MFA theft or something along.
Yeah, you don't want to be in the situation where an account gets compromised and someone for months now has unfettered access to your network or something like that.
Yeah, even 9 days is
Yeah.
bad. So that addresses things like architecture debt, and it can also reduce your identity debt
Yeah,
because it can reduce the lifespan of sometimes.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cut your SLA down. I know we talked about in half, but I think it's actually going to need to be
It
way
needs to be faster than that. Yeah.
because of Mythos and Project Glasswing, which we've talked about on a previous podcast. So now is the time to be re-evaluating your patch cycle. Be prepared to see an onslaught of updates from different technology providers and make sure that you are gearing up for continuous patching over the next year or 2 years or 3 years,
Yeah.
because that is where we're going. And hopefully we'll have some better tools to help facilitate that.
No, we had a conversation with one of our clients yesterday about the speed at which we're now seeing vulnerabilities identified, exploited, and the delay in how patching actually functions. So you need to be ready to patch like right away.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, there's no sitting back and waiting. Like you don't want to end up as the next
And the
Echo
problem
hacks.
is you
Sorry,
need to be able to
Equifax.
test.
Sorry.
That's a good one. So yeah, that'll address you
Yeah.
got to address operational debt and think about those time spans shrinking.
Right.
You want to close us out with an important executive takeaway?
Yes, this is a great one. There needs to be an expiration date on any security exception, and they need to be reviewed very, very
Yes.
frequently, like
Agreed.
quarterly. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're sticking in and any rule for someone to remotely access the network because you have an exec who wants to work from home for a couple of weeks or something like that,
Right.
make sure you're tracking on that and that exception is removed in a timely fashion because if you leave it sitting there, somebody will find it and that will turn out to be a problem for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here we go.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in and learning about the 5 different types of security debt. I just thought it was fascinating to really dig into these
This was a cool
cases
topic.
and
Yeah, I
organize
like this
them.
one.
So, yeah, we will hang out and take questions.
So we have one that says, "We know we have security debt, but we can't fix everything at once. What should a mid-sized organization start with?"
Okay. I mean, honestly, I think, oh, there's so many places to start. That's actually a really good question. I mean, there's the really simple ones like MFA.
Yeah, MFA, the
It's
big one.
just like boom right
Yep,
there. But in order to implement MFA, you have to be tracking all your assets,
sure.
which means you have to address that governance debt. So I'd
Yeah,
say tackling those two things, getting a really good inventory of what you have, especially if you've been through any mergers or acquisitions or just changeover of IT staff. Knowing what you have is like the precursor to being able to secure it. So make sure you know what you have so that you can secure it. Step one.
yeah, exactly. No, yeah, get a roadmap basically. And I mean, the other thing that we see in a lot of cases, especially for some smaller organizations, is they'll have software that doesn't necessarily allow for something like MFA. Like they'll have a custom piece of code that was written for them by a local developer, and that feature is just not there. So understanding how to properly segment and secure that specific application again comes down to the roadmap. Like understand where your risk lies and it kind of put a value on it. Like what do we need to tackle first here?
Yep. And again, some of the low hanging fruit, like phishing resistant MFA,
Yeah,
making sure you're patching, cross
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
makes
Then
sense.
get to the more complicated stuff.
All right, next
Ooh,
question.
this is a good question.
So my executives see security debt as a tech problem. How do I get them to treat it as a business risk?
I mean, a lot of times this means that I'm guessing reading between the lines that this person is not getting the budget that they need.
Probably, yeah.
And I mean, ultimately, all technical problems stem from humans. And having budget and resources to address them is really critical.
Mm,
I think every crisis is opportunity. And anytime you have, no, it's true. Every crisis is an opportunity. And anytime you have even a minor incident, take advantage of that. Analyze it, bubble it up to your executive team and say, hey, here's what happened. Here's how we resolved it. Here's what could have happened.
right.
And make sure that it's not, make sure you're telling that story because then they'll understand what you're accomplishing. If you don't make it visible, the near misses, then they may not understand how much is actually getting done with the existing budget or what the risk is. And then doing things like risk assessments, having third party to come in, make it visible with pretty charts and graphs. That is getting easier and easier now
It
with
is.
better tools and technology. So think about how you make the risk visible to your executive
Yeah, how do you make it clear that a cybersecurity risk is a business risk? Like that's just really what it comes down to.
and tell stories.
All right, we got one more.
Yeah.
So if AI can now find and exploit vulnerabilities in a day, isn't the situation hopeless for defenders?
Oh, don't be sad. First of all, it's less than a day. Uh,
Yeah, it's minutes, but yeah,
But, no, I mean, I've been talking about some other folks about this. It's possible to burn down a building. That doesn't mean all buildings will get burned down, right? I mean, no, it's true. You wanna
trying to
put
figure out where you're going with this one, but
where I'm
yeah,
going is that just because you can get hacked into and hackers could potentially take over, doesn't mean that they will. Um,
yeah.
so have hope.
Yes, no, it's not hopeless. What it comes down to for me is, and again, this is coming from the IT perspective, but it's defense in depth. So making sure that you are following best practices, and I mean, if you need to segment your network, if you need to have additional security controls in place, so that a single account being compromised can't compromise the entire network or something like that. I mean, that kind of becomes the name of the game. If something's going to be hacked, it probably will be. So let's anticipate that ahead of time. Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. But yeah,
I mean, that's true. Plan for things to get compromised and just
yeah,
put roadblocks in place so hopefully you can detect and eradicate that
yeah.
adversary before it becomes a major problem.
No, we had a comment from the seminar I did yesterday where we were talking about phishing training. And they were really going into how despite the level of training that they go through and how many phishing tests they put out there, like somebody will click on a phishing email.
I mean, we
Yeah,
have great immune systems, but we'll all still get
exactly.
colds.
And the idea was IT and security on the back end said, you know what, we know that's going to happen, so we just need to have controls in place to make sure that if that does happen or when it happens, they don't get any further than that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so put up that wall.
And we have to accept the fact that there's no perfect security, but you can still make progress.
Yeah, totally.
So, with that, thanks again for joining us today, everybody. And we'll see you next week on Cyberside Chats.